All right, thank you everyone for joining this call. My name is Jean-Baptiste Tessot. I'm the Director of Operations at Sourcemap here in Europe. I would like to thank you everyone for joining this webinar on upcoming EU regulations, supply chain regulation. Before starting, I would like to introduce you to our two speakers today, and I would like to start with Marina Pedros Espinosa from NOVE. Good morning, Marina.
Hello, good morning.
Marina, you're joining us from Brussels, and you are a senior consultant at NOVE, who is a public affairs agency based in Brussels. You've been extensively working on EU regulation, and in particular in regulations regarding the upcoming EU Green Deal. Thanks a lot. We'll be asking you a lot of questions today. And we also have on the panel today, Marissa Brock. Hello, Marissa.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you for joining. You're in the US, and I know it's very early for you. I hope you have a cup of tea not far from your right-hand side.
I do.
You are the Senior Director in charge of Policy and Regulation at Sourcemap. And one of the reasons we wanted to have you today is to try and provide a background of what the US situation is and how we can better understand Europe, understanding the US. I'll try to share my slides, and I'll be asking everyone to bear with me if there's a little problem, but I think it should be okay. Share. I think I just wanted to kick off this webinar with a very simple graph, which you can all see, which looks like a little bit of a wave or a tsunami, if I had to take the terms used in Brussels over the past weeks. This graph is basically showing the number of new regulations or laws that have been enforced or that will be enforced in the next 24 months. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see that, some laws are already enforced in the US with the US Legal Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA. We've had laws enforced in France with the obviously AGEC law, the duty of vigilance, but also in the UK with the Modern Slavery Act. In Germany, famously, the recent Due Diligence Act law was enforced at the beginning of the year. And there's a wealth of regulation coming in the EU next year: EU climate law, EU climate raw materials, the EU CSRD, the EUDR. I had maybe to start with a question for you, Marina. If you're a company operating in Europe today, imagine you're a German company and you have to face with the new German law regulations, but you know that the EU regulation is coming. What is your priority? How do you know what law should be the one to focus on? Is it the national one, or is it the EU level one?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, JB. I think it is right, as you say, it is like a great number of new initiatives, new legislative proposals, and the ones that we already have in place. We normally talk as well about an avalanche of like new proposals, new rules, new obligations. It is definitely true there is so many, but then here I think is like very important to understand and to get into the details of EU regulation, what it is a directive, what is a regulation, where are the two of them like acting together, and what is the relation with the national regulation, as you are mentioning right now. It is true that in the case of, for example, due diligence, we have national legislation dealing with this. And we are discussing right now at the EU level, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. But here, the key term is the reference to this the legislative status directive. So here, this means that the basis is going to be set at the EU level. We are going to have the foundation at the EU level, setting what is the minimum for every company to achieve, what are the key objectives to achieve, and then is up to the different member states, different European countries to implement this basis, this obligation in the way they consider the best. And it is in this case, for example, in the German legislation, if they have more ambitious principles, more ambitious obligations introducing in their law, we will have to comply with these more ambitious obligations where we are working in Germany. But the basis is set at the EU level. So the basic minimum is set at the EU. Here, just like if I can complement with another key factor, here I think, in reference to one of the points that you made as well, like this like wealth of legislation, it may seem like a lot, but then when we enter into the details of this regulation, when we enter into the specificities, we start finding these commonalities, this common principle that are going to help us as well to implement each of them. When talking about the EU Green Deal, we're talking about an objective. So here I think it is important to bear that objective in mind and to start like trying to find the common principles and the common lines for each of them in order to implement everything, all the obligations in the most easiest way.
So what you're saying is that for a company in Europe, based in Europe, there will be somehow common points between the national laws and the EU laws, which will make it easier actually to navigate between the national laws and the international laws.
Exactly, yeah.
Correct. We'll move now to have a focus on the Green Deal. I forgot to mention to everyone that you can answer questions during the discussion that we have. You have a Q&A questions. Don't hesitate to ask questions. We will read them during the call, and we can answer. We will be able to answer them if it comes in the flow. So don't hesitate to send your questions. Marina, I'm going to try to share the next slide. Looking at, and obviously I can't find the slide that I have that I want to share with you. Sorry, these are my questions, so it's not, these are not the ones. I knew I would have a problem, but it's okay. We're going to deal with that very easily. Marina, looking at the EU Green Deal, and this is the slide that I wanted to share with you, sorry. We understand that the Green Deal is comprised of a multiple of laws. I don't know if we can say that it's multi-layered or if it's overlapping, but I guess the consequence is that for most of us, it's really hard to grasp the essence of the EU Green Deal and the way it was made. Is there a way to look at it in a way that we can make a very simple approach?
Yeah, definitely. I think here is you use two keywords that are very, very useful to understand the EU Green Deal: multi-layer and overlapping package. The EU Green Deal, in order to explain like everything, EU Green Deal was born with the objective of climate neutrality in the EU by 2050. Having this objective in mind, it is helpful to use the term multi-layer because we understand there are different layers, different contexts in which the EU Green Deal is implementing different policy proposals, different policy files. We have energy, we have product life cycle, we have decarbonization policies, consumer information of due diligence. Once we have this multi-layer scheme, it is easier to understand like everything is part of the same objective. For me, when I'm explaining the EU Green Deal, I like to use the reference of like a puzzle to understand like every different piece makes part of a whole context, a whole framework. It is in this case where we start seeing all these like overlaps between different policy proposals, because it is true that once we enter into the details, we find this common wording, common objectives and references between the different texts. We have everything related to due diligence, for example. Here, the key objectives is to introduce new rules, new corporate rules to define corporate behavior in order to translate the Green Deal objectives. It is true that I said at the beginning that EU Green Deal is climate neutrality, but it's also about sustainability. It's also about the circular economy and all this decarbonization policy that also falls into this multilateral scheme. So with corporate sustainability due diligence directive, what we are doing is to have this overall harmonized concept of sustainability transferred to corporate behavior. But at the same time, we have eco-design for sustainable product regulation. What they are trying to do is to introduce these rules to improve sustainability of products. So objectives are very similar, but like differentiated by different sectors, different contexts. One thing that we say before is as well ideas like commonalities. When we have like these proposals, we try to finalize these common elements that are like repeated in the different proposals from the Commission, and we have the willingness from the Commission to go for sustainability, and for them sustainability means information. So information for the Commission also means traceability. Everyone needs to know what is happening in their value chains, in the supply chains, in the way that we are producing, we are consuming things. And information should not be only something that is required for companies to show how they are doing things, but also like to explain to consumers why they are taking one decision or the other, why prices may increase for a product or something like this kind of like aspects. I think here, like the way to best understand EU Green Deal is about understanding it as a puzzle, where we have these common elements and where we have pillars and bases, and traceability is one of the key bases for the EU Green Deal, because like we need to understand where everything is coming from. We need to see everything that is intertwined in supply chains, all the different stages in supply chain. So that's why if we go to deforestation, for example, going back to due diligence context, there is a need to understand where we are supplying from. The Commission needs to understand where things are coming from and where we are importing them from. So that means like precisely identify the areas involved in the cultivation of products, for example.
Okay, this is all very clear, and thank you. You created this graph that we're looking at the moment. So the pillars, basically the way the product is conceived, and that's the product life cycle. And one knowing which is included is the ESPR, so what will become the digital passport. Another way is how the business is operated, and that includes the due diligence. And in the due diligence, you mentioned the deforestation, but there will also be the forced labor, and obviously the way the company report about the way they proceed. This is the CSRD. And the last bit, which is also important, which is downstream, basically the way you speak to consumer and the way you will communicate the information of the products to the customer. And this is through the directive on substituting green claims. And what you're saying is that underlying all these laws, you actually have traceability as a common point. I have a question for you. We saw that some of these laws have already been enforced, and we saw that on the 29th of June, so that was last week or the week before, the EUDR was enforced, yet we're still waiting for guidelines. But at the same time, EUDR is basically covered by the CSDDD, so the due diligence directive, which is still in the process of being discussed in Brussels. So my question for you is, if I'm a company and I see that coming, what is the timeline, and when do I know that I need to get ready? Do I have 2 years? Is it now that I have to start?
There's a very good question. It is definitely now when every company working in the EU should start being prepared for this. It is true that as you say, deforestation, it has been enforced. It has entered into force on the 29th of June. What is coming, like we are still discussing forced labor, we are still discussing corporate sustainability, due diligence that is going to work as the umbrella policy for all the due diligence laws and obligation. But it is definitely important to start preparing, because like once these laws are going to enter into force, that means that we are not going to have a lot of time to comply with the obligations. In the case of deforestation, for example, it has started right now, but we have like 1 year from now to collect all the precise information and to be prepared to comply with the regulation. That means that in 1 year, companies are going to be obliged to precise the geolocalization of every product that is falling in under the regulation scope. They are going to have to show all the information, like for example in forced labor, they are going to ask companies to provide all the data from involved in supply chains, where they're sourcing from, what are the conditions like for workers in the different stages of value chain, and provide that information to authorities. It will only be like 15 days. It is true that these obligations may seem right now that is like there is enough time still to prepare, but once these new rules are going to get into place and they're going to enter into force, it is true that there is like not a lot of time to be prepared for everything and to gather all the information. So I will say it is definitely needed to start get prepared now. The current mandate where we are discussing all these like different pieces of legislation is coming to an end. We have
you mean the mandate of the European Parliament, meaning
exactly.
that elections will be coming in next May. So basically we have a year from now.
Yeah, we have the European election exactly in June, so that means that we have like this time, like everyone is going to try to rush to finish everything and to finish before these elections, because we don't know like what are going to be the new people in the next mandate, and like what are going to be the key aspect. But we know that next mandate is going to be about implementation. That is for sure, because we have the regulation already being discussed and almost finalized now. So I will say like time is the sooner the better in this case, and to start getting prepared now, because it is true that we can find commonalities in the different policy files, but they are asking for very detailed information as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Marina. So we've seen what European companies operating internationally are facing within Europe. But switching back to you, Marisa, the US have already adopted a regulation, the UFPLA. So if you're a European company operating internationally, but also in the US, what sort of regulation are you facing? And is there a similar dynamic in the US with regards to supply chain regulation?
Yeah, great question, Jean-Baptiste, and thank you again for including me in this session. There really is a common theme amongst the US regulations and the European regulations, in that if you are a large multinational corporation that has subsidiaries or brands, if you're a parent company based all over the world, you really do have to be worried about and compliant with a whole host of regulations. It's not just, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act if you are based in Germany. You may be a multinational corporation, and then you're worried about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, which prevents products that are made whole or in part using forced labor from entering the United States. So this really is a common theme across these regulations. We're seeing this also with US regulations that are still in the proposal stage and the draft stage. The New York Fashion Act is a great example of that. That is a US state law that has been proposed that could have global implications, because it is intended to prevent apparel and textile products used in the fashion industry that are made with either forced labor or specific environmental risks, from being sold in the state of New York. Any of you who are familiar with the fashion industry are aware that could encompass a very large number of international brands and international companies. So that's an example of a US state law that has international or global implications, similar to the UFLPA. So really, really important at this stage for companies that have business all over the world to really understand their risk, understand which products they're using that have some risk factors for either social or environmental risk. Again, forced labor risk, deforestation risk, monitoring carbon emissions in some cases, really getting a sense of where you are at risk and what laws apply to you based on where you're selling, where you're based, where you have, brands or subsidiaries. and really getting a handle on that. Because even though a lot of the EU regulations that Marina just described have a relatively long lead time in that some of them have not fully gone into force yet. Even with the deforestation regulation, there's a amount of time that will go by quickly, but a relatively long amount of time compared to US laws that go into effect immediately for companies to get in compliance. The sooner the better. There really is such a large list of regulations that are coming down the pipeline, and the sooner you can prepare yourself and understand where you're at risk, the better position you will be to comply.
Focusing on the UFLPA, which has been enforced for a year now, so we start having a little bit of understanding. What have companies been confronted with? Like, what were they requested to do? Basically, what do they need to identify with regards to this law very specifically?
Yeah, so the UFLPA was really a transformative law in the US regarding forced labor. It specifically targets the prevention of forced labor entering the United States originating from the Xinjiang region of China. It is a really kind of all-encompassing regulation in the sense that while US Customs and Border Protection has focused on specific materials or specific commodities that they have identified of having a higher risk of forced labor originating from that region, there aren't a list of commodities like the EU Deforestation regulation that are in scope and other commodities are out of scope. Really anything can be detained under the UFLPA. And the specific language included in that regulation is what makes it so transformative. It is that whole or in part language. So specifically it says any product manufactured whole or in part using forced labor. So what does that mean? That means that, let's say you're manufacturing a wooden toy, and 99% of the toy was manufactured in another country, and then a tiny percentage of it, the wheels were painted in the XUAR. That would be enough for CBP to lawfully detain that shipment from entering the United States. And as a company or as an importer, you would then have the opportunity to contest that detention. So you can contest either admissibility or applicability of the law. This is a relatively high burden to clear, because if you are contesting, hey, I know that I was using a supplier based in the XUAR, but I don't believe they were using forced labor, for example. That is a nearly impossible presumption to contest with CBP, because the law specifically states that CBP can use a rebuttable presumption that anything manufactured in the XUAR was made using forced labor. So essentially, what that translates to is it would take a huge mountain of evidence to convince CBP that even though you are using a supplier in that region, that they actually are not using forced labor. So what more importers are doing is contesting applicability. So in that case, they're contesting, hey, CBP has detained this shipment, but I don't believe, or I know, not I don't believe, I know that I was not using suppliers in the XUAR. So in that case, you are demonstrating that you have mapped every single supplier in your value chain associated with that product. You've also traced chain of custody for that product. So at each point in which the product changed hands, moved to a different supplier, was transformed in some way, you have all of that information. You're collecting the transportation records and payment records for that good. So based on what I just described, I mean, you can imagine this is quite a lot of documentation. This is a lot of information that an importer would need to collect. And so from our perspective at Sourcemap, what's really critical here is ensuring that you are collecting this information before you get a detention, rather than in the event of a detention, scrambling to collect all of this massive amount of documentation, tracing your suppliers, collecting chain of custody. what really needs to be adopted for compliance with the UFLPA is a preventative approach. So understanding where you're at risk, mapping your supply chain. Am I using suppliers that are in this region where CBP will assume or presume that forced labor is occurring? If so, what do I need to do to ensure that I am utilizing different suppliers in the manufacturing of this product so that I don't then have to contest admissibility or applicability under the UFLPA?
Yes, understood. And actually, we saw also in the news in the month of May that actually not only the CBP but the US Congress has reached out to international, American, European, or other internationally based company to ask them questions on the way they were actually operating. And some of the questions are extremely detailed and tricky. I'm just reading it out one. Please provide a detailed description of the steps you have taken since the UFLPA took effect to examine your supply chain with respect to forced labor risk in the manufacture of your products. And how does it differ from what the methods you utilized before the UFPLA? And then it goes on into the details of each material. This is something extremely specific, and then there's an active action of the regulator to ask companies to report on this, and there's also containers being detained. Last question to you, Marissa, before moving back to Marina, but how have companies reacted to that?
Great question. So Congress has sent out a series of letters, to your point, asking companies to basically prove that they have taken steps in the shadow of the UFLPA to address forced labor within their supply chain. So this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before about a preventative approach. There are companies, absolutely, many companies that are doing it right in that they are mapping their supply chain well before the UFLPA went into effect. So they were already doing this for a number of reasons, some of which were identifying risk, but some were ensuring that they were sourcing responsibly, ensuring that they were aware of all of the suppliers within their value chain, that there weren't suppliers that were owned by companies they didn't want to work with or based in areas that they were uncomfortable sourcing from. And in the case of these letters from Congress, this was an opportunity for companies that were doing it right to prove, hey, this is the work that I've been putting in for years. We actually have been mapping our supply chain. We've been conducting a risk-based approach, well before the UFLPA went into effect. But for companies that had done nothing up until that point, that's where they really faced a challenge. So the congressional letters, unlike the authority that CBP has under the UFLPA, companies were not necessarily obligated to respond to these letters. Some we know responded with, hey, it's difficult to collect this information. Others who had been doing it right responded with a whole list of documentation of this is exactly what we've been doing before the UFLPA, after the UFLPA, and over the course of the last year. And why is this important? U.S. Congress has really prioritized supply chain due diligence. So the UFLPA is already a very strict regulation, but we know that this is a priority for this Congress on both sides of the aisle in the U.S. and for the White House. So we're expecting more regulations, stricter regulations, expansion of the UFLPA in the sense that CBP will continue to focus on more products, more materials. And this is really exponentially increasing as an area of focus in the US because it's not just positioned as, we want to address this obvious human rights issue, but also it is a matter of national security. If companies that are importing into the US don't know where their products are coming from, that is a major red flag and a major issue for this Congress. So the broader point here is this issue is not going away for companies. They can't just wait this out and expect that the focus will shift and forced labor in supply chains will no longer be, a concern. It will continue to be a concern, and the sooner that you can put a process in place to demonstrate that you are conducting risk-based mapping for your supply chain, the better prepared you will be across the board.
I understand. Thank you, Marisa. And Marina, this is very interesting. We have an example of what a regulator can put in place and the sort of dialogue that a regulator can engage with international companies with regard to enforcing supply chain regulations. Is what we're seeing in the US similar to what we could be seeing in the EU, i.e., is Europe approaching, this regulation and the enforcement in a similar way? And by this, I understand burden of proof. So who is responsible to provide what? And in the same way that containers are being held by the port authorities in the US, what penalties do we risk for a company in Europe?
Yeah, thank you, JP. I think here what is important to highlight is that the US regulation came before the EU regulation, and obviously the EU was also like basing itself on what it was already in place in the case of the US. So in this case, I have to say like the approach it is similar. It is like the same objective and the same kind of like understanding of how to implement this. There is like different differences on the way we approach the forced labor regulation in Europe. In this case, it's important to base like to say that in the case of the EU, we have investigation approach. So meaning that we have due diligence, like companies should be introducing, like companies should be put in place in order like to comply with the regulation. It will be like a basis for every company as well to introduce the due diligence system, because we don't have any specific scope for the EU regulation. As Marisa was mentioning, we don't have like a number of products under the scope, as in the case, for example, of deforestation. But we neither have a specific region we are targeting. So the EU is basically introducing the obligation for companies to have like this due diligence for supply chains, to know what is happening in value chains, and to have full control of where the operations are coming. And you mentioned the burden of proof. I think this is like also like very relevant. Here, the key difference and the most important element that we need to highlight is that in the EU case, we are still discussing the final form of the regulation, and that is one of the key aspects that are still under discussion. The European Parliament right now is pushing for having this burden of proof on companies, meaning that is the company that should be given all the information and has to prove that they are innocent or no links to forced labor, while the Commission was proposing like to have this obligation to identify the link to forced labor to competent authorities that will ask companies to provide all the information. So that is like one of the key points that we are right now discussing. We have we need to see what is going to be the final form. And one key difference as well with the US regulation is that the EU is not only targeting imports. We also have under the scope experts from the EU. We also need like to make sure that no product marketed into the EU market is linked to forced labor. That means also like domestically produced products. So we have this overall perspective that also links with what we were discussing at the beginning, this like kind of umbrella policy that is the corporate sustainability due diligence, introducing these sustainability rules and like this like sustainable behavior from companies in order to also comply with forced labor.
Okay, so basically a situation that is not much easier for companies operating in the EU, because if I understand you well, the scope is wider, it's less detailed, and companies are left with more uncertainty. But what you're saying is that if you put in place a process that allows you to have due diligence that is peering over time, and then you can report it, then you put in place a process that is acceptable by the authorities.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, sorry, you wanted to add something?
No, I think that is like the I think the overall is like this mechanism, due diligence mechanism for companies to comply with this obligation and to have like access to all this data that not only forced labor, but deforestation, for example, is also asking companies to comply with due diligence directive as well. Yeah.
Okay. Marisa, coming back to you and maybe looking more at the product side or the practicalities. You're a company, you're international, you're based in Europe, you export to the US, you have all these different contingencies, level of details. Would you say that there is a way to tackle all this with one approach that could serve all the causes or the regulation? And if yes, how would you do that? How is it possible to implement that?
Great question. Something that we're seeing with companies that are, multinational, based with subsidiaries all over the world, with brands all over the world, is this concern about having multiple workflows to comply with this, large list of regulations that are coming down the pipeline. But the positive here is there really is a common through line amongst the majority of these regulations in that they're requiring companies to understand where they're sourcing from. So from our perspective, from a technical perspective, that involves discovering all of the suppliers in your value chain. So that's step one. Step two is mapping those suppliers. So understanding where they're based, who you're sourcing from, the path that your product is taking. So where is it going along the value chain and when is it being interacted with each respective supplier? And for, apparel and textiles, for food and agriculture, for automotive, supply chains can be enormous. They're much larger than I think the average consumer might realize that they are. And so for companies, this can feel like a really challenging burden to identify all of those suppliers. But what Sourcemap does and what our approach has been is we are collecting your supplier information directly from the supplier. So, at the company level, you likely know your tier one suppliers, so your direct suppliers, but you're not necessarily going to be able to map all of the suppliers all the way back to the farm level, to the point of origin level. Most companies just don't have that visibility into their value chain. What we are doing at Sourcemap is the company is identifying their tier one, their direct suppliers. Then we are going to the direct suppliers and having them disclose who they're sourcing from. Then those suppliers are disclosing who they're sourcing from, and so on and so forth. And so essentially at each stage in the value chain, your suppliers are disclosing their own suppliers, and that allows us to collect this robust, comprehensive, complete map of your supply chain using zero-party data. So we're collecting directly from suppliers. We're not using an AI approach for this data collection, because again, for compliance with a lot of these regulations, to bring it back to the UFLPA, you do need to collect information directly from your suppliers to be able to meet the burden of proof to contest a detention, for example. And so that really is a common through line amongst these regulations: the discovery of suppliers, the mapping. Then there is the risk approach. So identifying risk within your value chain. That can either be for forced labor, it can be for environmental risk, it can be for deforestation, et cetera. Identifying that risk obviously looks different based on the risk that you're looking at. The markers for forced labor are different from the markers for deforestation risk. But this is really a critical step in terms of compliance for these regulations. So what we've done at Sourcemap is really develop a tool that is adaptable. So we have customers that are not just worried about the UFLPA, they're also worried about the EU deforestation regulation. We want to make things as efficient and comprehensive for our customers as possible, so that they don't have to use multiple tools to comply with these differing regulations. They don't have the bandwidth to do this. That is, a big challenge. And so to make things as easy as possible and to identify the commonalities in these regulations in terms of the requirements is really a critical stage.
So to your point, actually, I saw that we've had a couple of questions regarding the tools and one question about EUDR. I wanted to share a slide that you sent me, which is this one, which is basically illustrating what you were saying earlier. And I guess this is discovering the supply chain on the right hand, know all the supplies in the supply chain down to the farm or to the mine in order to assess risk. And coming to the point that was asked a bit earlier in the discussion by one of the attendees, specifically on EUDR, the question was, well, EUDR is going to ask companies to potentially geolocate or make the polygon of the farms. Do you think that is something that is possible and reasonable to ask to companies?
It absolutely is. However, we recognize that it definitely is challenging, particularly for certain industries. We know that there's a particular challenge for conventional products as opposed to certified, particularly in some of the industries in scope for the deforestation regulation. However, what I will say is Sourcemap has been applying Polygon Mapping for deforestation monitoring well before the EU deforestation regulation went into effect. And there's a lot of ways to do this, one of which is to collect this data using a mobile application. This is actually explicitly, I'm sure many on this call saw the draft FAQs document that the EU published last week on their website, that the note about collecting this data via a mobile application is explicitly noted in that FAQs document. There's ways to collect this even in areas that are very remote, in areas where there's probably not a great internet signal, a Wi-Fi signal. There's ways to do this, and getting this information right is really critical for compliance with the deforestation regulation. One of the reasons why Polygon Mapping and why we anticipate why Polygon Mapping is noted in this regulation as opposed to GPS point mapping for particular areas of the regulation over 4 hectares of land is if you're monitoring for deforestation risk, if you're just looking at the GPS point on a map, you're not getting the full coordinates of a farm. And let's say the southernmost corner of your farm actually is in an area that is that has been deforested after the cutoff date for the deforestation regulation. If you were just collecting GPS point data, you wouldn't necessarily get that full comprehensive look of the risk at the farm level for your products. So we anticipate this is why this was included in the regulation. We recognize that this is a challenging thing for some industries that have not had to do this. But similar to the UFLPA, what I anticipate will happen with the deforestation regulation is it really will be transformative. Now that this is, officially moving forward, it is a requirement for industries. Industry will absolutely need to adapt. That might mean doing things a little bit differently, which has absolutely happened in the case of the UFLPA. But this really is a core part of Sourcemap's anti-deforestation solution is that Polygon Mapping collection.
This is very clear. And while you were speaking about UFLPA, we had another question regarding you were speaking about evidence to be provided. And one of the questions we had was about what data can be collected. And I think you just happened to also give us a slide, which is about the traceability and the chain of custody. How is this, or can this be related to forced labor, Marissa?
Yeah, so chain of custody is a really important component of identifying forced labor risk. So what does that mean in practice? It basically means you're collecting all of the data to prove the journey that your product took from the point of origin level all the way to being imported into the US in the case of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so the specific data that US Customs and Border Protection has made clear that they accept in terms of chain of custody documentation include transportation records and payment records. So, if you're looking at a large product with a lot of suppliers, that can be a lot of data. That's all of the transportation records, all of the payment records associated with that product. But this really does allow for some degree of assurance that forced labor is not occurring when you have all of that information. That means at that point, if you have all chain of custody data, you have mapped every associated supplier, and you also know exactly which journey, the path that your product took. And every time that it changed hands, every time it was transformed in some way, which again is just a really critical step for the identification of forced labor risk. So this has really been the approach that SourceMap has taken. Our approach is directly modeled after CBP's guidance. It's modeled off of CBP's importer guidance, and meets that burden that's needed to ensure that forced labor has been monitored within your value chain, and ensure that you're collecting the right information to contested detention.
Thank you, Marisa. I'm just conscious of the time, and I don't want to be going too much over the time that is allowed to us. Marina, I would like to come back to you maybe for a thought on concluding this this discussion. A lot is happening. We're still not sure how this will going to end up being in the EU. We know it's coming fast. If I had to, as a company, keep in mind one or two ideas to, which would guide me in the process or in my understanding and what I have to implement in the coming 6, 12, 24 months, what would it be?
So I will say two key aspects that we also mentioned in the conversation. I think first of all, sustainability for the Commission right now means data, means information, and information means traceability for them to have full control, companies having full control of what is happening in their value chains. And also this risk-based approach and the risk assessment of any kind of impacts operations can have on environment, on human rights, and on this perspective, to implement the due diligence approach. I would say that those are the three key conclusions of everything that is happening in the EU, because it's true, it is a lot, but it is possible as well to find commonalities and principles in everything. Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. Marisa, if you had to do a similar conclusion, what would you say to try and help people who are following this webinar to feel a bit better about all that?
Yeah, definitely. I think my greatest advice at this point would be to start now. Start mapping your supply chain now and identify where there might be information. There might be a gap in information, a gap in data, so that you have sufficient time to remediate those gaps in the time allowed for compliance with not just the EU regulations, but the US regulations as well. The sooner, the better. As I mentioned earlier, there is a common kind of through line with these regulations in the type of data that you're collecting. Obviously, there's variations here, whether you're collecting information on environmental risk or forced labor risk, et cetera. But the identification of suppliers is a critical step for all of the regulations that we've discussed today. And so that's really where companies should start. Start mapping your supply chain, identify tools to do so, because this is not something that you can just collect via email and spreadsheet. It's a huge amount of information, and that's not a practical way to collect that information, and it's just not an efficient way. And so identify the tools that you can use to efficiently collect this data, and identify where there might be gaps in information in this time, because even with the deforestation regulation, for example, 18 months will go by very, very fast. So really starting as soon as possible, cannot emphasize that enough.
Thank you, Marisa. We had a question actually coming up earlier when we were speaking about all this regulation, asking what is the best way for me to stay tuned with all the regulations coming up. And from the top of my mind, I would say there's a few of them. One is receiving the newsletter that Marissa is producing on policy update regularly. The second would be to contact Marina at NOVE, but there's another one that I wanted to share with everyone, and it is, this one. Marina and Marissa, you both drafted a very good ebook on regulation that came out last month. And if you have any detailed questions, you can obviously reach out to Marissa, or reach out to us in order to receive this ebook on regulation. You can contact Marissa at sourcemap.com or me, JB at sourcemap.com. I wanted to thank you both, Marina and Marissa, for your time today. And I wanted to tell all the attendees who sent questions to which we haven't been able to answer that we would be reaching out soon. Thanks very much, and bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.